Today we're going to be talking about backendless security, and the subject is fairly complex and includes a lot of different things for the reason that backendless security is fairly a large system, just like backendless itself. And we thought that it would be fairly important to discuss this topic because we see a lot of applications being developed with Backendless, and many are going into production. And it's very important to secure one's data, files, messaging channels, and so on before you go to production. So in today's agenda, we're going to be discussing the following items. So we're going to be talking about application roles and users because they are in the core of security in Backendless. I will be providing a lot of demos for restricting access to application data, and we'll show you how to work with individual roles and apply security of those roles and users to the objects that you are saving in Backendless. And likewise, it's going to be applicable to files and many other assets in Backendless. So here, I really don't like to spend a lot of time in webinars in PowerPoints. So let me just jump into the code and Backendless console, and we'll be going as a very hands-on webinar. If you have any questions as we go, feel free to ask them right here in the questions pod, or type them in the chat section of the GoTo webinar, and I'll be periodically looking at those areas and go to webinar and make sure that I'm answering questions as we go. So first and foremost, I'm going to switch to Backendless console, and here I will create a new application, and I'm going to call it security webinar. Here it is. Click save. So this is going to be a brand new application that will contain all our data, and right now it's absolutely empty. There is a users table, but it has 0 users, and we will start working with that app. So if you have played with Backendless, you will know that every single application is identified by ID. If you didn't know, once you log into Backendless and under app settings, you will see a bunch of different IDs. The most important one is application ID. That's the ID that identifies your backend among many others that are hosted in our system. There's also a bunch of various IDs that we call secret key, although a proper term would be API key, because it is not so much secret. If you're building an application with JavaScript, it's going to be wide open, and it is not intended to be completely secret. So this is more of a not proper terminology, but and more than likely we'll be changing them to API keys. So whenever you use the API calls, whenever you communicate with Backendless, these IDs are absolutely mandatory. So here I put together a little program that sets up data and just populates that data with our backend. And this is in Java, but exactly the same API would be applicable across the board in Backendless, and it would look almost identical in JavaScript and iOS and .NET. So we try to model our APIs so they are exactly the same. As you can see, the very first line here initializes our client-side application, and this is where application ID and API key are being passed in. So let me set it up with app ID that for the application that I created. I'm going to click copy here. So it's copied into clipboard, and I will paste it into the code. So when we communicate with Backendless, these calls go directly into our application. So now I have the proper app ID and API key in the application, and we're just going to run the code to create a couple of objects in our backend. So here, let's select setup data and run it. All right, so now all the data is already in the backend, and if we click on the console and switch to data, we will see that now we have 2 order objects, and then each order object has a collection of order items. And if we click on the link, it will show you the order items that belong to the order that we clicked from. So here's the order number 001. We click on that, and we know that it contains an order item HTC One and Apple iPhone. So now we have this data populated in the backend, and notice that we didn't have to create tables by hand. Backendless deduced and created all these data objects simply by looking into data structures that we sent with the API call. And to review these data structures, the order class is very basic. It contains these fields. We have object ID, order number, the date when the order was placed, and the collection of items which belong to that order. And the individual item consists of a item name, price, and quantity. Very basic and rather primitive structure. Now, now that we have this data in the backend, anyone can query the data because it sits in wide open. However, in the real application, you will have users and you may have different application roles. So in order to start simulating environment that would be close to what you are dealing with in your application, we're going to create some users. But first, before we go there, let me just show you how retrieving this data would work. So here I do have a little example that once again initializes the application and then retrieves the first order from the order table and then prints it out. And this is what this would look like. So now we got the order. Notice that the order items collection is empty. It's not displayed. And this is for the reason that related objects are not loaded by default. And we can click on this auto load checkbox. And if I were to rerun this example without making any changes on the client side, you will notice that the order is retrieved. And now we have all the related order items retrieved with it as well. So here, as we retrieve this data, it is being retrieved by an anonymous user because we haven't logged in as anybody. And as a result, anyone can start querying this data so long that they have application ID and API key. To bring it closer to where real applications are, we're going to add a couple of users, and let's just add them manually. So here at one user, I'm going to use my email address, mark@backendless.com. Password is going to be just password. I'll save that user. And another user, let's make him joe@backendless.com, and same password to keep things simple. All right, so now there are two users in the system. Going back to our orders, notice that there is a column called owner ID. And owner ID is something that it's a special column, first of all, and it contains an ID of the user that is the author or the owner, in other words, of these objects. And it's very important in some systems that you have this relationship created in there. So here what we can do is simulate it by hand, but there is also a way to do it manually. So here I'm going to take mark@backendless.com and copy the object ID of that user and go back to the order and place that object ID in here as the owner ID. I'm going to do it for both orders. All right. So now both of these orders, they belong to Mark, and Joe doesn't have access to these orders. Okay. Now, therefore, whenever we load these objects, ideally what should happen is when Joe says, give me the orders, he should not get any orders. And when Mark says, give me the orders, all the orders come back to that user. So now we're kind of getting close to the actual enforcements that are being built by Backendless from the backend perspective. Before we start making these restrictions, let me go to the users screen and open security and restrictions. The reason I got here is because this is where we manage application roles. So these application roles, they provide access at the global level. So this is like the global matrix of access to various operations. So here for a not authenticated user, if I click on it, you will see that not authenticated users, they can do pretty much everything in the system by default, and you can tweak it any way you want to. So here we're talking about, let's say, data service, since we're working with data objects, and then the find operation is whenever we retrieve data from the backend. So let's say for not authenticated user, if I were to change it to the red X, meaning that the find operation is not allowed for the not authenticated user, and I go back to my code, notice that here, this is still not authenticated user, since we do not have any login operation. If I were to rerun exactly the same code, once again, I didn't make any changes on the client side, notice that the backend sends an error that says user has no permissions. And the reason we're getting this error is only because we restricted access for the not authenticated user for the find operation. Since this is a global matrix, it applies to every single table. Therefore, at this point, not authenticated user would not be able to retrieve anything from any table at all. Okay. It is also possible to change this where, let's say, we're going to grant it for the not authenticated user, go back to data, and since we're working with the order table, we can restrict this, we can do exactly the same restriction at the order table. Notice that if I click on table schema and permissions, and then switch to roles permissions, we have a list of all the roles right here. So not authenticated user, if I restrict access to the find operation, it's going to be identical. But at this point, the find operation is restricted to the not authenticated users only for the order table. So the net effect and the result is going to be the same. If I were to rerun this program, we will get exactly the same exception. But if I were to change this code, in fact, let me do it real quick. And I'm going to, rather than loading the order object, I'm going to load order item. So guess what? Once I run this particular code, we will be able to retrieve order item, because at this point, not authenticated users are allowed to retrieve order item. Changing this can be done either by switching to permissions for order item and restricting find here, or making the same change globally for all tables. Let me rerun. And we're getting an exception, exactly as expected. All right. So now that you understand how the roles work as far as authenticated, not authenticated, then we should start making more progress at this point. Okay, since we'll already have a user, actually two users, let's do this. We're going to log in a user, and then let's log in Mark at backendless.com. The password was password. So now at this point, any operation that comes after the login operation will be executed with an authenticated user. Therefore, any restrictions on the server would fall in under the authenticated user row in the permission table. So anything that the authenticated user can do would be allowed. And in fact, let me rerun this code. And as you can see, now we can load this particular object for that user. All right. A bit earlier in this webinar, I was talking about restricting access where you can load objects only that belong to a particular user. All right. Here, as you remember, in the data browser, under order, we set up the owner ID. So the owner ID points to the user object. In this case, I believe that was Mark. So these objects belong to user Mark at backendless.com. So it would be nice if we could just come in, and then if Mark logged in, he can load orders which belong to Mark. And then if Joe logs in, then Joe can load objects which belong to Joe. Now, it's very easy to actually set this up. And this is how this would work. So for the order table, if we log in, if we switch to the roles permission and deny access to both authenticated users and not authenticated users, okay? And I know it may seem counterintuitive because right now we're denying access to both authenticated and not authenticated. However, there is actually a third level of access, which we call owner policy. And you can see it right here. So owner policy says that if you are the owner, find is allowed. And in this case, this is the gray mark because it is inherited from the global matrix. And notice what happens. I'm still logging in as Mark, and I was able to get these objects. Now, if I change the login to Joe and rerun this code, I'm getting an exception. And that makes sense for the reason that Joe doesn't have permission to load anything, okay? Because as an authenticated user, he has no objects, and then therefore access is being denied. Let me check if there are any questions. There are no questions, and I see some people joined while I was talking. So please use the question section and the chat section to ask me anything as I'm going. I'm periodically checking the go to webinar panel here just to see if there are any ongoing questions. Okay, now let's do something else. If you remember, the owner ID was set up manually. We can actually recreate this completely automatically. So in order to do this, I'm going to flush all my data. There is a very, as you're developing, neat way to do this. If you click on the home icon and then click the reset button, here you can select data objects, and this deletes any data objects that we have created and kind of resets your application. By clicking data, you will see that now all our tables are gone. And if I were to set up my data, but now rather than rerunning this code as this, I'm going to log in as Mark. And once the user is logged in, any operations that will happen during that session of the logged in user, any objects that are saved will be automatically associated with that logged in user. Okay, so let me rerun that code. It's done, and here in console I'm going to refresh and check out the order. So notice that in the order table, the owner ID now is automatically populated, which means that all these objects, Backendless knows that these objects belong to a user with that object ID. All right, so here's something else that we can do. Right now, if I go to loading the data, as Mark, I will be able to load this data, okay? However, the permissions got reset, I bet. So I'm gonna restrict access. And permissions got reset because we reset application and deleted all the data. So now with this setup, Mark will be able to load data and Joe will not. Let's do that again. Order. Suppose that we want to change this behavior. So we want to make sure that, let's say, Mark cannot load these objects, but Joe can, even though Mark is the owner. In order to do this, it's actually very easy. We go to table schema and permissions for owner policy, and we say that the owner cannot load these objects. So as soon as we change find operation for the owner to X, then the owner will not be able to load these objects. So I'm rewriting this code once again without any changes in the code, and there is a permission. So at this point, owner cannot. But what if we want to allow Joe to load these permissions, to load these objects. It is also possible to accomplish. And for this, if we go to the permissions for the order table and select user permissions, and we say that Joe has access to the order table. Notice that the green check mark. So now as Joe, I'm going to log in and run the query. And at this point, Joe can get the data. So as you can see, the system is very flexible, and there are a lot of different things that you can do. Obviously, one of the questions that may come to mind is, what if you want to adjust these permissions programmatically? Because right now, anytime we adjust these permissions, we go to console and make the changes there. However, that's not the only way you can do it. There is definitely a way to control these permissions through the APIs. Okay, and let me show you how this can be done. I do have another example here called grant permission, and in this case we log in, and let's log in as Mark. Then I'm going to load an object that belongs to Mark, and then I'm going to find a user. So let's say get the order owned by Mark, and retrieve user Joe, and grant permission from Mark to Joe. All right, so here's what this example does. We log in as Mark, we load the very first object which belongs to Mark, then we retrieve user Joe by using a query. So we're going to be querying the users table and find the user object that satisfies this query. And then we're going to use the very special API called grant for user. So we're granting access to a specific object to a specific user. Okay. Before we do this, I guess before we run this example, let's get the system to the point where Mark can load objects and Joe cannot. So we'll just need to reset some of the things here. All right, so from the roles perspective, not authenticated user and authenticated user cannot run the find query. The owner policy is set where the owner can load objects, and everything else is back to the default. So running the get order, if we run it as Mark, we see that Mark can load these objects. And then if we log in as Joe, then we cannot load these objects. But now we're going to run another program, which basically that I just reviewed, where we grant permission to an order object for the user, and grant permission. All right, all done. So at this point, the user Joe has access to an order object, and in the get order, we still have Joe. Let's rerun it. And here it is. So now Joe can load this object. And as you can see, this was a demonstration of how to programmatically change access to a specific object. And this change that this API has caused can actually be seen in console as well. Let me show you where you can see that. One thing that I have not demonstrated yet is the access control list, which is the ACL for specific object. So in addition to the global matrix or permissions for individual table, there is also a set of permissions that each individual object has. So for instance, for this object, order 1, if I click on this ACL, then we're opening up permissions for specific order. And notice that in the user permissions, Backendless.com has defined permissions. So this green check mark was put in place by our code. I think there are some questions here. All right, I'm going to get to that. And which means that if you needed to make this change by hand, you can use console or you can do it programmatically. A question that may come by looking at this code is, can anyone just run this code? And the answer is no. In order to grant permissions to either users or roles, because there's a bunch of methods here, you can grant for all roles, or you can grant for a specific role, or for for all users. So as you can see, there are different variations of this method. In order to execute this API, you need to have a special permission. And the permission in order to execute this API is actually called permission. So right here, notice that these are individual operations: create, update, find, remove, describe, and there is an operation called permission. And this is where you run those grant and deny APIs. So for instance, if the user, an authenticated user, now can run those grant and deny, or in our case, let's say if we say that authenticated users cannot use this methods, but an individual user, let's say user Mark, can. All right, so in this case, if I were to rerun this code, it would work. If I remove it back to the default, then if I run this code, it would fail, because system will say you have no permission to change permission. And I'm sorry for just an overload with the term permission here. Now, there was a question from the one of the attendants. The question is, can we run a data load to load users, data, and permissions from CSV or JSON? You can, if I understand you correctly, you're asking if you can import data into Backendless. You can definitely import users and data objects. As far as loading permissions, I don't think the CSV supports that. We can quickly check this. So now we have a bunch of permissions, and if I go to let's say this table, and I say export, and let's say we're going to export everything that exists there. So now it runs the export operation, and then if we go to files and export, this is the file that was created. Let's just check what's inside. So let's say the order, yeah, it contains just the data. So the permissions are not being exported. If you're making changes to permissions, you would need to copy them somehow. However, one thing that we recommend, let's say if you're doing development and you have exactly the same data in different environments, development and production, if you go to manage and versions, you can create multiple environments. So here, the term version can be changed for environment. So you can create a new environment and call it production. When you're deploying from development to production or from development to staging, you use this deploy button. And here you can deploy pretty much anything. So if you're deploying data objects or users, then you can actually deploy permissions from one environment to another. And there is a conflict resolution mechanism where you can define what happens if there is a conflict, whether you ignore that conflict or you roll back or you override from one environment to another. So to answer your question, exporting and importing permissions is not possible through CSV, but it's possible to use the deployment from one environment to another. And in this case, everything will be copied over according to your conflict resolution policy. So hopefully that answered your question. All right, now we have reviewed a lot of different things, but one thing that I also wanted to mention is going back to roles. Here I was using the roles that are built in. It is also possible to add your own custom roles. And in this case, you could have a role, let's say, called admin. And you can add users to that admin role, and you can do so either in console. So here we have users. Let's say I want to make Mark at backendless.com an admin. And in order for this, you select the user, click user roles, and assign the user to that role. Click Save. So at this point, Mark belongs to the role admin. And in this case, if you were to make any kind of changes for roles, right here, if you click on roles, notice that there is an admin role in the list of all these roles. And anything that you make changes, just like I was describing earlier for authenticated, not authenticated users, the same thing would be applicable to your custom application roles. And you can create as many roles as you can. There is a limit in the free plan, but you can purchase additional roles and customize your system to any kind of degree of complexity. This is very versatile and flexible. One thing just to kind of reiterate, the way when you're managing roles for a specific table, you can do exactly the same thing at the users level. So you can assign individual permissions from users to a specific table. All right. So this is an example of kind of working with data objects from the security perspective. Exactly the same mechanism is applicable not only to data objects, but it's also available for files. So if you click on the files, every single folder right here, if you click on this link, the little lock icon, you will get the permissions table, which looks identical. So you have your roles and you have your users, but notice that the names of these permissions and operations are different. So for a folder, it could be read, write, remove, and permission, which is basically granting permission, granting role to a user or denying role to a user. It works exactly the same way. So for instance, if I were to go to web and there is this index.html, which we can see what it looks like. It just says hello world. In fact, let's just make a change and save it. In fact, let's just make it h1 hello world, just so it would appear a little bit bigger. We save it, and here I'm going to get the link, public link for that file by clicking on this particular icon, and here it is. Now we get the hello world. If I were to restrict access to this index.html, I click on the log, and for not authenticated user, read, I'm changing it to deny. And if I were to reload, we're getting an error that the user has no permission. Okay, so as you can see, it's exactly the same mechanism to control permissions from the console, but the behavior would become applicable to the resources as you would expect them to work. Also, similarly, you can make changes to these permissions to the scripts. So here, as you probably know, we have support for Node.js. And here, hello.js is a Node.js script that just basically uses Express to execute this code. So right here, whenever you load this script, hello.js, it executes the Node.js script, and then whatever the response is being sent back to you. So this hello world is not a static text, but it's produced by Node.js. You can restrict behavior by saying that this hello.js can be executed only by authenticated users. So here, if a not authenticated user has no permission to read it, if I reload, you get the exception back that it's not allowed. Control of the permissions can also be done at the folder level. So here, the hello.js sits inside of the scripts folder. So if for scripts, I change the permission where not authenticated users cannot access it, then rerunning it still provides the same error. But you can override it at the individual file level. So if I go to scripts, and for the hello.js file, I say that authenticated user has access. Then rerunning this would execute that script. So it's a hierarchical system. However, it can be overwritten by applying individual permissions to specific files, just like you can override it by applying permissions to individual data objects, even though the entire data table or folder may not have that permission. You will see the similar mechanism at the messaging level. So here we have a messaging channel, and if you click on permissions, you will see that permissions are different, whether it's publish or subscribe, and you can apply it either to roles or users. In geolocation, if you have a geo category, which we don't right now, but let's create one. Actually, we can create one using this nifty button, like set up sample data. All right, so now we have a geo category with a bunch of data in here. Click on permission, then you can change permissions for roles or for users. Okay, so this system uses exactly the same paradigm from the user experience perspective, but it's applicable to various systems which exist in your backend. That's pretty much it that I wanted to talk to you about today. I know it's a complex system, and you may need to rewatch this webinar. If you have any questions right now, I'll be more than happy to answer them for you. And but that's pretty much it that I wanted to share with you. Thank you, and I'll stick around to answer any questions that you might have.